When we were discussing the principle of sufficient reason, that there has to be a sufficient reason for something existing, when we were looking at the classical cosmological argument, we introduced the ideas that existence can come in degrees, which is not something that's common for us today, but in metaphysics there was at least a long-standing tradition, certainly a tradition from the Middle Ages that Descartes inherited, that existence came in degrees. Or if you think about it, if existence bothers you, think about it as perfection comes in degrees. And that's something that, at least in the modern mind, we can easily accommodate. So there's a hierarchy of existence or perfection, and what we're going to do is line up some things in terms of the degree of existence, or the degree of reality, or the degree of perfection. Highest to lowest is the way we're going to set up. The highest, if he exists, would be God, a necessary existence, a necessary being. Well, if you're thinking about it in maybe biblical or religious terms, right below God you kind of get the angels, people who are contingent existence, lower than that, where we're higher than animals, animals higher than plants, plants higher than rocks, and rocks higher than things that don't exist, like, I picked one at random, Santa Claus. Is non-existence or zero existence. We have God at infinity existence, Santa Claus at zero, and we have a whole hierarchy, a range of different kinds of objects whose existence has varying degrees as we go up the scale. And if you think about it, maybe a principle that's going to do a little bit better, but we'll see, probably not that much better, is what I'm calling CPI2, the causal principle of ideas. Number 2, if an effect exists, then its cause must exist and have at least as much reality or perfection as the effect. So the idea of what's the effect going to be in this case? It's going to be an idea. So for an idea to exist, its cause has to have at least as much reality. And using this, we can come up with maybe a refined version of the argument, starting, we have this infinitely perfect idea of God. So for that to, and this is going to be, the idea causation argument too, not quite Descartes, and I think we're going to find problems with it, but, if there is an infinitely perfect idea of God, then it must have an infinitely perfect cause of the idea, right? Because the idea is infinitely perfect, so the cause of the idea has to be as perfect. So from 1 and 2, we get, therefore, there's an infinitely perfect cause of the idea. Well, obviously, if there's an infinitely perfect cause of the idea of God, then God exists, right? Because he's got to be the infinitely perfect being. Therefore, God exists. Now, so at this point, it looks like we see where he's getting 1. 2 seems to be at least a little bit better than the last one. The idea behind the principle of CPI2 is, if you start with nothing, you end up with nothing. So if you're going to end up with something as an idea, you got to start with something that at least has enough reality to get it there. Okay, so 1 says, one looks like it says that, we have this idea of God, an infinitely perfect being. Premise 2, based on CPI2. Premise 3 just follows from 1 and 2. Premise 4 is really just kind of a new definition of God, or maybe part of the original concept of God. So it looks like the argument is good. Now, before we even worry about CPI2, the first thing we should notice is, there's an ambiguity in number 1. That is, we say there's an infinitely perfect idea of God, and we need that to get to the conclusion that there's got to be an infinitely perfect cause. But that, I think, is ambiguous between, and it'll come up on the bottom of this page, so one's ambiguous between 1a, there's an idea of an infinitely perfect God, or alternatively it could mean there's an infinitely perfect idea and this is an idea of God. The difference between the two being that the first one says that I have an idea of an infinitely perfect God, and the other one says I have an infinitely perfect idea. Now, our idea of an infinitely perfect God can have something less than an infinitely perfect cause. So obviously, to make the argument work, one has to really mean 1b, that is, the idea is infinitely perfect. But wait a second. I mean, that isn't what we're talking about. That's not what Descartes says, so that's not really going to help him. In addition to which, we're also worried about premise 2, that CPI 2, although it seemed pretty plausible, maybe people are worried about, but I'm more worried about 1. So, I mean, the conclusion is the argument needs 1b for it to work, and 1b just seems unwarranted. That is, the idea isn't infinitely perfect. It's an idea of an infinitely perfect being. But Descartes has a way around this. So in a second, we're going to turn to a distinction that he makes between objective reality, which is the reality that ideas have, and formal reality, the reality